Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
They stood arm in arm with the microphones like hosts warming up a crowd, faces set in that polite event smile they use at charity dinners and board anniversaries. And I remember thinking that the whole thing looked rehearsed in the kind of way where the punchline lands on me, not on them. Because in this family, I am always the lesson someone else is supposed to learn, and then my mother cleared her throat. My father squeezed her shoulder as if to steady the landing, and they announced that, after careful consideration and with total peace of mind, they had decided to update their estate plans, which was their gentle, country club way of saying I was out, erased, set aside, wrapped in a bow called responsibility and consequences. And they did it in front of everyone who has ever watched me try to be the reasonable one while knowing full well that being reasonable only counts when you also agree to be quiet. For a second the room made that sound people make when they want to be supportive, but have no idea what the rules are: a low murmur, a few nervous laughs, a cough that felt like it needed to apologize afterward. And I could see the exact calculation moving through faces I have known since childhood, the wives who tell me in private that they love my independence, the husbands who still greet me like I am the kid who refilled their iced tea, the cousins who grew up learning that my brother was the heir and I was the example, and in that airless moment my mother smiled in my direction with that soft, managerial smile that says she hopes I will meet this opportunity for growth with grace. Because there is nothing my parents prize more than the appearance of grace when they are doing something unkind. I felt the old reflex rising, that urge to explain, to remind the room that I paid for my own degree, that I covered my own health insurance when they pulled it without warning during a dispute over a holiday flight, that I have never once asked for a bailout even when it would have been easy, and then I let the reflex pass, because what I felt even more strongly was the click of something I had been waiting to see, the precise way they needed the audience to agree with them, the way humiliation becomes a group project, and I realized that this was not an ambush so much as a stage, and stages are useful when you are very clear about the line you intend to deliver. So I lifted my glass, not quickly and not in a flurry of emotion, but with the same steadiness I use when I sign my name on papers that matter, and I thanked them for the announcement, because transparency is good for families and very good for business. And I said I wished they had told me privately, but I understood why they wanted witnesses, because witnesses keep people from rewriting history later, and while a few folks shifted in their chairs my father tried to chuckle like we were doing some kind of bit, so I stopped him with a look I have used since high school when I had to tell teachers that no, my mother would not be handling this, I would. And then I said the one sentence I had promised myself I would be brave enough to say if they ever forced my hand. I said it did not matter, not because money is irrelevant and not because family ties cannot hurt, but because just that morning I had acquired something they could never take away. And I let the words hang there long enough for the front tables to trade glances and the back tables to lean in, long enough for my brother to send me that tired smirk he uses when he thinks I have overplayed a hand, long enough for my mother to move a step closer to my father, like she always does when she senses I am not going to back down, and I added that the gift I received did not require their signature, did not depend on their approval, and would not expire when someone decided I had disappointed them. You could feel the room trying to locate the safe reaction, because if they laughed and I was serious, they would look cruel, and if they looked shocked and I was joking, they would look foolish, and I think that is the moment I enjoyed, not their discomfort, but the quiet click of control returning to my hands, because I have learned that control is never about volume or titles or last names. Control is about timing, about saying a true thing at the exact moment when the lie expects applause. My father tried to rescue the scene with a speech about stewardship and making sure assets go to the most responsible branch of the family, which is his coded way of saying the branch that will always do what he wants. And I nodded like someone listening to a seminar she is already past, and then I thanked the guests for celebrating a long marriage built on discipline and tradition. And I said that in the spirit of discipline and tradition I would be making a small announcement of my own. Not to upstage anything, just to tidy up a few assumptions, and my brother rolled his eyes in that bored way he has perfected since childhood, but I saw two of my father's oldest colleagues lean forward with genuine interest. And that was all the momentum I needed. I said that starting the following week I would be hosting a quiet gathering for anyone interested in supporting a new initiative that centers grown children who finance their own futures without parental underwriting, and that the initiative had partners their accountants would recognize and terms that reward patience over posturing, and I did not elaborate because I knew the less I said the more those men would ask later, and the more they asked the more my parents would realize that the story had already shifted, that I was no longer the daughter being disciplined. I was the woman setting the room's agenda. My mother asked if I was talking about charity, in that careful tone she uses when she wants to sound generous while protecting the ledger, and I told her it was more practical than charity and more permanent than an allowance. And that seemed to unsettle her more than anything else, because permanence is the one thing they believe they control. And then I raised my glass again and wished them many more years of whatever they believe keeps them safe, because I have learned that safety is often just a story people tell themselves so they can keep others small, and I ended the toast by thanking them for the freedom they had just confirmed in front of everyone. Since there is nothing more liberating than being declared unnecessary by people who only value you when you are obedient. The applause came in hesitant waves, the polite kind at first, and then warmer as a few people who actually know me decided to show it, and while the room clapped I did something small that I had planned for exactly this kind of moment, which was to step off the dais, shake the hand of my father's oldest partner, and invite him to a brief coffee the next morning, not whispered and not hidden, just loud enough for the tables to see that the conversation was moving to me now, and when he agreed, with a smile that told me he already knew more than he was letting on, I felt the first clean snap of payback settle into place, not cruel and not theatrical, just effective. That was my revenge for the night, simple and surgical, taking the oxygen they wanted for themselves and redirecting it toward a door only I could open. And as I looked back at my parents still holding their microphones like they were waiting for the crowd to come back under their spell, I realized the spell had already broken, and the best part was that no one knew yet exactly how far the break would spread. Which is why the next morning mattered more than any inheritance ever could, because some things cannot be taken when you never asked permission to have them in the first place. When people ask me now if I saw it coming, I usually just smile and say that in this family nothing ever happens without a prelude, even if you only recognize the opening notes once the song is almost over. Because the truth is there had been years of small rehearsals for moments like that night, each one disguised as constructive guidance or setting expectations, which in our household was code for reminding me that no matter what I accomplished on my own, I would never be the one they built the pedestal for, not when Michael existed, not when the son who could do no wrong stood ready to inherit not just assets, but also the carefully cultivated approval that was treated like currency at every family gathering. Growing up, I learned to read the room before I learned to read chapter books, because that was the only way to survive dinners where my father quizzed us like potential candidates for his empire. Questions about balance sheets and market trends directed mostly at Michael, while mine were about why I hadn't been more pleasant to a guest or why I couldn't lighten up in conversations about things that mattered to me, and every time I pushed back, no matter how logically or calmly I would be met with that look, my mother's tight-lipped patience that said I was once again proving why I was difficult. It's a word they repeated enough that I eventually understood it was their shorthand for anyone who refused to perform the role assigned to them. It wasn't that I wanted their money or their approval on their terms, at least not after a certain age. It was that I couldn't quite understand the logic of rewarding someone who coasted on charm while punishing the one who actually carried her own weight. But in their world, charm was the currency that multiplied, while independence was treated like a debt you owed them for not needing them. So every achievement I earned outside their reach was greeted not with pride, but with this subtle irritation, like I had missed an opportunity to make them look generous. That irritation became sharper as I got older, and it took on a new flavor after I refused to move back home during what they liked to call a transitional phase after my first serious breakup. A phase they clearly saw as an opportunity to fold me back into the fold and remind me of my place. I stayed in my own apartment, paid my own bills, and they never forgave me for making that choice without asking for their opinion. The truth is, their anniversary party was not the first time they used a public setting to deliver a message. A few years back, at a charity auction, my father joked into the microphone about how I was still single and clearly in no rush to give them grandchildren. And while the crowd laughed the way people do when they think it's harmless, I remember clocking every single person who caught my eye with that half-apologetic look that says they know it wasn't harmless at all. That's when I realized my parents liked to wrap their judgments in a kind of public performance. It kept me in a position where defending myself looked like overreacting. That night I stayed quiet, but I promised myself I'd never let them have the last word in a room again, and the anniversary party became the moment to cash in that promise. The invitation to the anniversary itself was almost suspicious in how polite it was. No digs, no last-minute guilt trips about whether I'd bring someone, just a neatly typed card in an envelope that smelled like my mother's perfume. But then came the subtle shifts, a call from my mother to say they had moved me to a different table, so I'd be more comfortable, a message from my father about how they'd arranged the seating to keep the flow of conversation balanced, and a random reminder about the dress code, which in the past had always been an unspoken assumption. They were micromanaging in a way that didn't fit the occasion, but I chalked it up to them trying to control the optics for their friends. It wasn't until I walked in and saw exactly where they'd placed me, close enough to the podium to be visible, but far enough to not be part of the family cluster, that I started to feel the edge of something sharper underneath. I'd like to say I had no idea what they were planning, but the truth is, part of me recognized the setup the moment I took my seat. I'd been here before, not in a ballroom, but in the dynamic. They speak first, the audience nods, and I'm left with the choice of swallowing it or taking the bait. The only difference now is that I had been preparing for this in my own quiet way, though at the time I didn't know exactly how it would play out. About 2 years before, after a particularly tense holiday where my father announced, in front of Michael, that he was reevaluating how the estate would be handled, I started thinking less about how to win their approval and more about how to make sure their approval became irrelevant. That shift didn't happen overnight, but once it did, every interaction after that was less about defending myself and more about observing them, mapping out the patterns they didn't realize they had. It was during that period that I began making moves that seemed unrelated at the time, consolidating certain investments, cutting ties with joint ventures that gave them indirect influence over my finances, and strengthening connections with people they either underestimated or actively avoided. I didn't call it revenge then, because it wasn't, it was self-preservation. But when I sat there at their anniversary party, listening to them announce my erasure from the will like it was a moral victory, I realized that all those small steps had been leading me toward a moment exactly like this. One where I could absorb their performance without flinching, because the real outcome had already been decided and they just didn't know it yet. That night, after the toast, people kept asking me what I meant, and I gave them the same vague answer I gave my parents, that it was something they couldn't touch, couldn't influence, couldn't even fully understand. And I could see in their eyes the two conflicting instincts, curiosity and self-preservation. The ones who leaned toward curiosity, I kept close. The ones who leaned toward self-preservation, I let drift back toward my parents. It wasn't personal, it was positioning, and I had learned from the best, even if they didn't realize it. By the end of the night, my parents had reclaimed enough control of the narrative to smile for photos and accept congratulations on setting boundaries, but the people who mattered, the ones who could shift influence and resources without a single public word, had already begun looking at me differently. They didn't know exactly what I had done, but they could feel it, and that was enough to start tilting the ground ever so slightly under my parents' feet. That tilt would become a shift soon enough, but first, I needed to make sure the right people were standing on my side of the line when it happened. The choice to stop asking for approval and start designing my own runway did not arrive as a brave morning where I stared into a mirror and declared independence. It arrived as a slow recalibration after one holiday dinner where my father praised Michael's maturity for agreeing to sit on a board he had not earned while telling me I should learn to operate within a structure, and I remember thinking that if structure was the game, I could build one that did not leave me begging for a door. Key every time they felt like teaching me a lesson, so I began with the unglamorous work that never makes it into the glossy family updates. The careful inventory of where my life was tangled with theirs, and the measured process of untangling without triggering alarms that would bring the whole house down on my head in a show of righteous discipline. I started with the account that looked harmless, the kind families open to help you get started, a joint investment bucket that came with a soft lecture about stewardship and a very firm clause about approvals. And I told them I wanted to simplify and move my portion into a vehicle with fewer fees, which sounded practical enough to pass without a fight. What I did not say was that I had opened a new account in my own name at an institution they had never used, and that I had already set up an automatic transfer schedule that would, over time, take my assets somewhere they could not delay or freeze under the pretense of helping me think clearly. It took months, and I smiled through every patronizing question, and by the time they noticed the balances had shifted, I had enough of a buffer to keep moving without their commentary. Parallel to that, I started saying yes to invitations I had always avoided because I knew how they would read them: coffee with people my father calls competitors in public and friends in private. Lunches with attorneys who specialize in things my family pretends will never touch us. Calls with a retired controller who spent decades inside companies like my parents and knew exactly where the pressure points lie. I listened more than I spoke. I asked the kind of questions that sound naive only to people who have never had to pay their own tuition, and over time those conversations converged into a picture I could actually use. A map of influence that did not rely on my parents' approval, but could still reach across their world and tap the glass when necessary. The most important connection came by accident, or at least that is how it looked from the outside. A friend of a friend who used to work with Daniel Avery, a man my father alternately respected and despised depending on whether Daniel was useful that quarter, and when I finally sat down with him I understood why Daniel made my father so uncomfortable. Because he is the kind of person who refuses to pretend that loyalty and leverage are the same thing. We talked for an hour about nothing consequential, and then he asked me directly what I wanted, and I told him the truth as plainly as I could. I wanted to build something that allowed me to stop negotiating my self-respect at the dinner table. And I wanted to do it without using my family name like a crowbar. He did not give a speech about mentorship or legacy. He said, "Fine, then you need cash that is clean, information that arrives before everyone else hears it, and a reason for smart people to return your calls." The reason for calls came sooner than the cash, because I had already been collecting small wins that, taken together, looked like competence rather than rebellion. I consulted on a restructuring for a regional supplier who had been squeezed by one of my father's pet firms, and when my proposal worked, they introduced me to their software vendor, which led to a quiet contract review that uncovered a change of control clause most clients had never read closely, a clause that said any shift in ownership would trigger a fresh consent process with key customers. That clause mattered because the vendor's largest customer group included companies in my parents' industry, including their own, and while I did not plan to weaponize that, I did note that influence sometimes hides in the boring paragraphs other people ignore. What I acquired over the next year was not a single trophy, but a lattice of relationships that made something bigger possible. With Daniel's guidance, I set up a small vehicle to take minority positions in firms that sit just off stage from my parents' world. The kind of infrastructure businesses that do not make magazine covers, but hold the keys to timelines and approvals. One of them was a compliance and reimbursement company with an old-school founder, Richard Hale, who cared more about continuity than flash, and who was quietly buying out early employees over time. I never used my last name. I showed up with references and questions, and when he offered me a sliver, I took it and did not brag, because a sliver is how you get invited to discuss who might take the next sliver. And as people cycled out for ordinary human reasons, retirement, divorce, boredom, I expanded, all within rules, all documented, all paid for with money that could be traced back only to me. By spring of this year, I held a stake large enough to be taken seriously and small enough to avoid gossip, but with proxies aligned through other holders who trusted me after I fixed two problems they could not solve, I had more than a voice. I had a vote that could set terms on certain client arrangements when conflicts arose, including grace periods, including exceptions that my parents had relied on for years while preaching accountability to everyone else. I did not cancel anything. I did not threaten anything, I did not need to, because the existence of the option was the thing, the knowledge that I could refuse to extend the usual courtesies that had kept them comfortable while others paid full freight. I told Daniel I would never use it to hurt anyone just to prove a point, and he said that was exactly why I was the right person to hold it, because restraint is its own form of leverage when everyone expects a spectacle. When the anniversary invitation arrived, I already had a calendar full of quiet meetings with Richard and two other holders about a more formal change that would consolidate decision rights and clean up a messy governance chart. And it was not until the week before the party that the timing sharpened into focus. The papers were ready, the votes were aligned, and the only thing left was a consent letter that would be delivered to major clients right after signatures. A letter that would land on my parents' desk with all the weight of a neutral administrative update and all the implication of a door with a new lock. I did not plan the scheduling as a stunt, but when they decided to turn their party into a performance, they handed me the last ingredient I needed, because if you are going to make me small in public, then I will make my boundaries official in private. My revenge that week was not loud, and it did not require a scene. It was an email I sent the morning after the party to Richard and the counsel on the deal, confirming my signature and authorizing delivery of the consent letters without the usual informal outreach to favored clients. Because favoritism is the thing they taught me to despise unless it served them, and I wanted the process to be clean, predictable, the same for everyone, including my parents. By the time my coffee with my father's oldest partner ended, he had already heard that a change of control notice was circulating for the compliance company his firm leans on for audits and reimbursements, and he asked me, with more curiosity than judgment, whether the rumor was true that I would be chairing the committee that decides exceptions. I told him I would be chairing a committee, and he nodded like a man who knows a tide when he feels it at his ankles. And as I left, I realized that the next call would not be to me but about me, and that was exactly the point. The morning after the party began with the kind of quiet that makes you think maybe the world has decided to go easy on you for a few hours, but then my phone lit up with a long message from my mother that managed to sound both pious and wounded, insisting that the announcement had been necessary for clarity and that I had embarrassed them by speaking out of turn. And while I could have drafted the usual measured reply that tries to build bridges over craters, I left it unread, because the work I had to do that day did not involve navigating her tone. It involved confirming that the consent letters had gone out exactly as planned, that the governance shift had posted to the right registry, and that the committee I was chairing would be staffed with people who understand fairness is not a favor you extend to the family you like. It is a policy you apply even when it catches your own blood in the net. By mid-morning, I was sitting across from my father's oldest partner in a coffee shop that does not require reservations or introductions, and I watched his expression move from polite curiosity to that slightly amused respect people reserve for the moment they realize the person they underestimated has been using the time well, because he had already heard, through the reliable whisper network that keeps the wheels turning in our corner of the economy, that the compliance firm his company relies on for clean audits had undergone a change in control that placed final exception authority in a committee I would lead, and he did not dance around it or try to make me feel small. He asked a plain question about whether the informal grace periods his friend had enjoyed would continue, and I gave him a plain answer that the policy would be consistent for every client regardless of last names or golf course alliances, which he received with an almost relieved nod, because the truth is most professionals are exhausted by the constant bending of rules to satisfy someone's ego disguised as tradition. The next call came from Michael, who opened with a laugh that sounded practiced and asked if I had gone full vigilante, which is a phrase that only lands when you grew up protected by parents who called any accountability a personal attack. And I told him that nothing I had done was dramatic or personal or even remotely illegal. It was administrative housekeeping with an emphasis on transparency, and if that felt like revenge to him, maybe the problem was not the policy but the dependency. He muttered something about me playing with fire and said Dad would want a meeting, and I said I would be happy to meet with their counsel present, and mine as well, at my office, during regular business hours. with an agenda sent ahead of time so that we could all use our time like adults who respect boundaries, and he went quiet in that way he does when he realizes the old rhythm of me apologizing for being prepared has left the room. The act of revenge that day was not a performance or a speech. It was a set of signatures and one carefully worded directive to staff that no exceptions should be granted on audits or reimbursements without full documentation as outlined in the most recent client manual, which I attached for convenience and copied to counsel so there would be no confusion. And because I know exactly how my parents' company operates under pressure, I also sent a separate note to the external accounting firm, reminding them that the change in control included a recalibration of risk ratings, meaning that the foundation my mother loves to reference in every speech would be reviewed with the same rigor applied to everyone else's foundations. And while that review is routine and fair, it is also something they have coasted through with minimal questions for years, and that was not going to continue simply because they felt entitled to a lighter touch. I did one more thing that felt small and yet tasted like oxygen, which was to file my updated healthcare proxy and power of attorney documents and send confirmation to the family attorney that my parents were no longer listed on anything that would allow them to speak for me in a crisis. Not because I anticipated a crisis, but because there is a very specific freedom that arrives when you know your life cannot be paused or rerouted by people who use access as a leash, and I wanted that freedom documented in a way that did not require a conversation or a blessing. It simply existed, and they would learn about it when their calls were politely declined by a hospital that no longer had them on file as decision makers. By late afternoon, my father called and, in a tone that he probably thought sounded calm, but came through like someone walking on broken glass, asked whether the rumors were true that I had inserted myself into a vendor his company considers a strategic partner, and I said that if he meant the compliance company, then yes, there had been a governance update that clarified roles and tightened standards for exceptions, which he should appreciate since he has lectured me for years about standards, and I added that if he was worried about disruptions he could rest easy because the process was designed to protect the stability of every client, including his, provided that documentation and timelines were respected. He answered with a long silence and then asked if I was really willing to put the family through an audit cycle without the usual flexibility, and I told him the family could handle it just fine, since we are apparently so committed to clarity. What changed that day was not their immediate access to anything tangible, because real systems do not shift overnight. What changed was the story they had told themselves for decades, the one where I would always need them more than they needed me. And I could feel the tremor run through that story as calls started bouncing around the network, board members asking whether this meant anything for their own exceptions, friends of friends asking whether they should reach out to me directly or pretend they hadn't heard, my mother's peers checking in with the careful tone that says they want to be supportive, but never at the expense of their own standing, and I did not rush to soothe anyone, because calm policies do not require constant translation. That evening I sat at my small kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and read through the meeting agenda my assistant had already compiled for the conversation my father demanded, and I thought about the line I had dropped at the party, the one about acquiring something they could never take away, and I realized how close they were to understanding it and how far they still had to go, because they kept trying to look for a check or a title when the answer was a kind of permanence that does not show up in photographs, and that is why the final move mattered more than any of the steps that came before it. The move they had never anticipated because it required them to see me not as their daughter who could be punished into compliance, but as the person who read the fine print and used it to build a door only I could open. A door they would knock on sooner than they ever imagined, which is exactly what happened 2 days later when their counsel called mine and asked in the most careful voice whether I would consider a private meeting to discuss mutual interests, and I said yes, bring everything, because now we were finally ready to speak in the only language they respect. 2 days after the party, we sat across a long conference table with our attorneys opening folders like referees at a game that had already been decided. And my father tried to start with small talk as if this were just another vendor meeting his company could steer, but I interrupted gently and said we should all save time by laying out what was actually on the table. which was not a fight over emotion or approval or a seat at Thanksgiving. It was a straightforward acknowledgement that the governance shift at the compliance firm had closed the side doors they had used for years, and that any future arrangements would live or die by the same standards everyone else respects. And while I could have smiled through another dance around the word family, I stayed with policy because policy is the one thing that does not wilt under pressure, and for the first time in my life I watched my father register that the usual tone management would not get him what he wanted. Their counsel tried the only card left, which was to suggest transitional accommodations for legacy clients and to float the idea that I should recuse myself from any matter involving my parents' company. And I said I would happily recuse where the charter required it and nowhere else, because I was not here to create special rules that would later be used as precedent to weaken the whole system. And to make the point clear, I slid a short letter across the table confirming that the consent notices had been received and that the committee's schedule for the first round of file reviews would begin the following week, with weighted risk assessments that had been set before the party and could not be adjusted without a supermajority vote, which we already held. And the room understood immediately that they were negotiating against a clock that did not care about bruised egos. Michael, who had spent the first half of the meeting spinning a pen like a bored teenager, finally leaned in and asked what I wanted, because every story in our family eventually comes down to that question. And instead of giving the speech they expected about childhood unfairness or public humiliation, I told them I wanted the same thing I have wanted since I stopped asking for permission, which is a line that cannot be moved depending on who is asking. A process that treats my last name like any other last name, and a life where my choices are not subject to a retroactive vote at their dinner table. And if that sounded personal, it was only because I had been forced to live inside the overlap of their business instincts and their parenting instincts long enough to know they did not think those were separate categories. My father asked again whether there was a path to protect his timelines, and I said there was, and it was the same path every client walks: full documentation, clean data, accurate dates, and 0 phone calls to me seeking favors, because those calls would be logged and forwarded to counsel, and if he wanted to hear me say it in a softer way, he was going to be disappointed, since clarity is not cruelty even when you do not like the outcome. What I did not announce in that room, because I prefer to let systems reveal themselves rather than narrate them, is that the position I held at the compliance firm was not merely a committee chair with moral leverage and paperwork weight. It was a controlling stake held through a trust one established the previous fall, an irrevocable structure that names no family member as beneficiary or advisor, and that cannot be amended by pressure, guilt, or theatrics. Because the assets are not mine in the casual sense that can be guilt away, they are mine in the legal sense that resists emotional trespass, which is the exact reason I used the phrase at the party about something they could never take away. And although they suspected the truth, they would only confirm it weeks later when a routine diligence poll showed the filings to their counsel, who then had to explain to them that what they assumed was posturing was actually the kind of permanence they have always reserved for the son who follows rules set by people who never have to follow rules. The revenge I delivered at the end was not a spectacle or a speech that would get clipped and shared by relatives. It was a quiet, surgical move that would live in footnotes and schedules where real power hides. Because after the meeting I signed one more directive that adjusted the standing policy regarding philanthropic entities affiliated with clients, a policy that had for years given foundations like my mother's an easier ride under the assumption that they served the public interest, and I rewrote it so that every foundation tied to a for-profit enterprise would be reviewed by a separate audit pod with no access to social calls or back-channel emails, which meant that my parents would either run their charity by the same standards they celebrate from a podium, or they would answer questions they are not used to hearing. And while that might sound petty to someone who has never watched a family brand itself as principled while cutting lines others weighed in, to me it felt like the only kind of fairness that teaches anything, because the lesson is not that I can hurt them. The lesson is that they do not own the rules anymore. When the meeting ended, my father gathered his papers with the careful hands of a man counting something that keeps slipping, and my mother asked if there was any hope of mending things if we just spoke privately as a family. A question that might have broken me a few years ago, but now landed as an invitation to the same old choreography, and I told her the door was open to affectionate, adult relationships with clear boundaries and no financial entanglements, which is the only version of family that survives in the long run, and if that sounded cold, it was only because we had never tried it before. She nodded without understanding and left the room, and Michael lingered just long enough to say I had made my point, and I said gently that the point was not mine. The point was the policy, and the policy would be there long after all of us were done posturing. I walked out into a day that felt ordinary on purpose and called Daniel to say the meeting went as predicted. And he laughed, that short laugh of someone who has watched this play from both sides, and told me to take the rest of the afternoon off, because the best part of building something you control is remembering you are allowed to enjoy it. And I did not need the permission, but I appreciated the reminder. That night I sat alone and finally said the words out loud that I had kept close for months, that the thing they can never take is not just equity in a company or a chair on a committee. It is the end of the leash they thought they could keep hidden in the fine print. It is the freedom to make decisions without wondering who will punish me for being myself. It is the knowledge that I will never again audition for a role in a family pageant that runs on loyalty points and selective memory. If there is a lingering conflict, it lives in the space where their version of love meets my version of respect, and maybe that never fully aligns, but the final move is clean and permanent, and the victory that matters is real. I did not win a crown, I won my terms. And they will spend the rest of their lives wondering how I pulled it off, while I spend mine not wondering at all.